afternoon, everybody. As Colin said, I am the Private Sector Officer for the Scottish Climate Change Impacts Partnership. So I just want to give you an overview, I suppose, of some of the challenges that we see in terms of communicating climate change, not just to the private sector, but communicating climate change to all of our stakeholders, and look at how we would maybe like to work more with research community and with our stakeholders in terms of getting the message out there more effectively. Just to give you a little bit of background about SCCIP, SCCIP was set up in 2005, and our overall aim is to increase the resilience of organisations and infrastructure in Scotland to meet the challenges and the opportunities presented by the impacts of climate change. And I suppose we often focus on the negative when we talk about climate change, but it is important that we look at the opportunities as well. I think that is particularly relevant for the private sector. Some of our objectives are supporting the policy framework implementation, in particular supporting the Scottish Government with the implementation of the adaptation framework and the sector action plans, providing support to organisations and communities in terms of dealing with climate change adaptation, trying to help build capacity among our stakeholders so that they can build up those adaptation skills and can integrate adaptation more effectively into their work. We see ourselves as a gateway for adaptation information in Scotland, and we also support the application of the projections and other key climate information. We got increased funding in 2009, which allowed the team to expand, and so there's now 4 of us, managed by Julian Holbrook. As I said, I'm a private sector officer. I have a colleague, Anna Beswick, who liaises with the public sector, and my colleague Joseph Haig, who's here today, is the science officer. Our main portal, I suppose, is our website, scip.org.uk, and I suppose an awful lot of what we do is about communication and about delivering those adaptation messages to people. One of our communication tools is our newsletter, which goes out on a monthly basis, and I suppose we would encourage any researchers that want to put out information in this way to contact us about that. So in terms of climate change adaptation, I suppose we all know that there are going to be impacts from climate change going forward. So what needs to happen in the coming years? Well, I suppose we need to plan effectively for a changing climate. We may not know exactly what's going to happen, but we do need to plan to take this into consideration. We need to use the best evidence that we have available, and ultimately we need to get to a situation where businesses and the public service providers are considering climate change and the decisions that they're making, and that individuals and communities are recognising some potential climate change impacts and are taking action to protect themselves. So the best evidence that we have is SCCIP Online. It's a product of a very large undertaking by the climate science community. 7 years work by the Met Office, Hadley Centre, UK, SIP, and lots of other contributing organisations. So we have this best evidence out there. It's freely available for everybody to use. There's a website, so everybody that wants to access it can access it, and you can really delve deep into it to find some customised information. So it's a very comprehensive data set. It addresses many of the shortcomings that we saw in UK CIP02. It has responded to a lot of the user demands for more information. But for many, I suppose it has delivered maybe too much, or it's not quite what they expected. And there's a huge amount of data. There's maps, there's graphs, there's plume plots, there's key findings. And for many, it can just simply be overwhelming. So it's a really difficult challenge to take this information and to communicate it to the people that need it. And I suppose we see this as one of our challenges, and it's a challenge to the science community in general out there, to communicate this climate information in a way that's useful to the decision makers. And that's not just the policy makers, it's also the businesses that I would deal with, and that business-facing organisations that I talk to a lot deal with. It's also local communities, and it's the wider public sector. And and SCCIP is aiming to communicate this information through a number of channels, through training, guidance, conferences, pilot projects, case studies and so on. These are some of the things that we are aiming to do to try and communicate this information. But ultimately, I think what people want to know, what organisations want to know, is not necessarily whether it's going to be 2 degrees hotter in July 2050 than it is now. It's what exactly does it mean for me, in my community, my policy area, my business organisation, my process. These are the kind of things that people actually want to know what it means for them. Some of the kind of things that we have been doing to try and communicate this information in a way that's relevant to people. We have some guidance. We produced private sector guidance, which was launched in July of last year. And that's a top-level guidance that directs private sector to a lot of the tools and information that's out there. It's quite generic, so it doesn't look at specific sectors. My colleague Anna is about to launch her public sector guidance in the next few weeks. Again, that's quite top level, but it is combined with a workbook for practitioners within the public sector so that they can look at what their vulnerability is to climate change, their adaptive capacity, and ultimately build in adaptation into their processes. We've also developed some key messages for Scotland in terms of climate.